Capone's wealth in 1927 was estimated at close to $100 million. Al Capone, who became the Prohibition era's most famous gangster. Prohibition. Prohibition, legal prevention of the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States from 1920 to 1933 under the terms of the 18th Amendment. Although the temperance movement, which was widely supported, had succeeded in bringing about this legislation, millions of Americans were willing to drink liquor, distilled spirits, illegally, which gave rise to bootlegging, the illegal production and sale of liquor, and speakeasies, illegal, secretive drinking establishments, both of which were capitalized upon by organized crime. As a result, the Prohibition era also is remembered as a period of gangsterism, characterized by competition and violent turf battles between criminal gangs. Origins of Prohibition. In the 1820s and 30s, a wave of religious revivalism swept the United States, leading to increased calls for temperance, as well as other perfectionist movements such as the abolitionist movement to end slavery. In 1838, the state of Massachusetts passed a temperance law banning the sale of spirits in less than 15-gallon quantities. Though the law was repealed 2 years later, it set a precedent for such legislation. Maine passed the first state prohibition laws in 1846, followed by a stricter law in 1851. A number of other states had followed suit by the time the Civil War began in 1861. By the turn of the century, temperance societies were a common fixture in communities across the United States. Women played a strong role in the temperance movement, as alcohol was seen as a destructive force in families and marriages. In 1906, a new wave of attacks began on the sale of liquor, led by the Anti-Saloon League, established in 1893, and driven by a reaction to urban growth, as well as the rise of evangelical Protestantism and its view of saloon culture as corrupt and ungodly. In addition, many factory owners supported prohibition in their desire to prevent accidents and increase the efficiency of their workers in an era of increased industrial production and extended working hours. Bootlegging and Gangsterism. Neither the Volstead Act nor the 18th Amendment was enforced with great success. Indeed, entire illegal economies, bootlegging, speakeasies, and distilling operations, flourished. The earliest bootleggers began smuggling foreign-made commercial liquor into the United States from across the Canadian and Mexican borders and along the seacoasts from ships under foreign registry. Their favorite sources of supply were the Bahamas, Cuba, and the French islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon, off the southern coast of Newfoundland. A favorite rendezvous of the rum-running ships was a point opposite Atlantic City, New Jersey, just outside the 3-mile, 5 km, limit beyond which the U.S. government lacked jurisdiction. The bootleggers anchored in that area and discharged their loads into high-powered craft that were built to outrace U.S. Coast Guard cutters. That type of smuggling became riskier and more expensive when the U.S. Coast Guard began halting and searching ships at greater distances from the coast and using fast motor launches of its own. Bootleggers had other major sources of supply. Among those were millions of bottles of medicinal whiskey that were sold across drugstore counters on real or forged prescriptions. In addition, various American industries were permitted to use denatured alcohol, which had been mixed with noxious chemicals to render it unfit for drinking. Millions of gallons of that were illegally diverted, washed, of noxious chemicals, mixed with tap water and perhaps a dash of real liquor for flavor, and sold to speakeasies or individual customers. Finally, bootleggers took to bottling their own concoctions of spurious liquor, and by the late 1920s stills making liquor from corn had become major suppliers. Bootlegging helped lead to the establishment of American organized crime, which persisted long after the repeal of Prohibition. The distribution of liquor was necessarily more complex than other types of criminal activity, and organized gangs eventually arose that could control an entire local chain of bootlegging operations, from concealed distilleries and breweries through storage and transport channels to speakeasies, restaurants, nightclubs, and other retail outlets. Those gangs tried to secure and enlarge territories in which they had a monopoly of distribution. Gradually, the gangs in different cities began to cooperate with each other, and they extended their methods of organizing beyond bootlegging to the narcotics traffic, gambling rackets, prostitution, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and extortion. The American Mafia crime syndicate rose out of the coordinated activities of Italian bootleggers and other gangsters in New York City in the late 1920s and early 30s. Johnny Torrio rose to become a rackets boss in Brooklyn, New York, and then relocated to Chicago, where in the early 1920s he expanded the crime empire founded by James, Big Jim, Colosimo into big-time bootlegging. Torrio turned over his rackets in 1925 to Al Capone, who became the Prohibition era's most famous gangster, though other crime czars such as Dion O'Banion, Capone's rival in Chicago, Joe Masuria, Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Bugsy Siegel are also legendarily infamous. Capone's wealth in 1927 was estimated at close to $100 million. In 1929, the year of the stock market crash, which seemingly increased the country's desire for illegal liquor, Eliot Ness was hired as a special agent of the U.S. Department of Justice to head the Prohibition Bureau in Chicago, with the express purpose of investigating and harassing Capone. Because the men whom Ness hired to help him were extremely dedicated and unbribable, they were nicknamed the Untouchables. The public learned of them when big raids on breweries, speakeasies, and other places of outlawry attracted newspaper headlines. The Untouchables' infiltration of the underworld secured evidence that helped send Capone to prison for income tax evasion in 1932. Also in 1932, Warner Brothers released Howard Hawks's film Scarface, The Shame of Nation, which was based loosely on Capone's rise as a crime boss. The previous year the studio had started a craze for gangster films with Mervyn Leroy's Little Caesar, 1931, and William Wellman's The Public Enemy, 1931. The cultural influence of the era proved lasting, with gangster films remaining popular and Ness's exploits giving rise to the television series The Untouchables, 1959-63. Repeal. Prohibition had been an important issue during the U.S. presidential election of 1928, but Herbert Hoover's win over Al Smith ensured that what Hoover called an experiment, noble in motive, would continue. As the Great Depression continued to grind on, and it became increasingly clear that the Volstead Act was unenforceable, prohibition faded as a political issue. In March 1933, shortly after taking office, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act, which amended the Volstead Act and permitted the manufacturing and sale of low-alcohol beer and wines, up to 3.2% alcohol by volume. 9 months later, on December 5, 1933, Prohibition was repealed at the federal level with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which allowed Prohibition to be maintained at the state and local levels. After Prohibition was repealed, there was a dramatic decrease in alcohol consumption and a dramatic decrease in crime rates. Most states agreed to repeal Prohibition and only 2 states opposed it. This showed that our nation knew that Prohibition was a big mistake, but to every mistake there is always something learned from it.